NBC News investigation now into some key evidence from a serial killer case that haunted the Pacific Northwest for nearly 2 decades. People knew this guy as the Green River Killer. From the early 80s to the 90s, dozens of women disappeared, only to be found dead.
In the quiet streets of Seattle and the deep woods of South Carolina, 2 names would forever leave a mark of horror upon the American psyche.
Questions are growing about why one of the most notorious serial killers in U.S. history was suddenly booked into the King County Jail today.
Gary Ridgway, who is better known as the Green River Killer, is normally locked up at the state penitentiary in Walla Walla. Now, for the first time in 20 years, he's in a Seattle jail cell.
The Green River Killer, Donald Pee Wee Gaskins. These men, whose lives appeared as ordinary as any.
Let you go, but I wasn't going to let her go. Just loved killing women. When I started killing, I just kept on killing them.
Carried within them the darkest of secrets. They were monsters that walked among us, leaving trails of death that stretched across years. The chilling reality is that the most horrific individuals can look like anyone, the neighbor, the coworker, the family man. But their souls harbored darkness too profound to comprehend. As the world watched, the question remained: how could ordinary men, with families and jobs, lead lives so entwined with evil? The answers lie in their pasts, their actions, and the twisted psychology that drove them to become what they were, killers. A family man with a dark secret, Gary Ridgway, a seemingly unremarkable man, led an average life until the veil was pulled back. By day, he worked as a truck painter, a husband, and a father. To those around him, he appeared to be just another man living his quiet life in Seattle. But beneath that facade, Ridgway hid a monstrous truth. In the early 1980s, the Green River area in Seattle became known for something far more sinister than its quiet riverside views. Prostitutes and runaway girls, often desperate and living on the margins of society, found themselves in the crosshairs of Ridgway. He was a predator, carefully selecting victims, and his hunting grounds were ripe with vulnerability. The girls on the Strip, a well-known area where prostitution ran rampant, were his targets. Ridgway's first victims were discarded in the Green River, a hauntingly appropriate place for such unspeakable acts. It wasn't long before the body count began to rise, with young women vanishing without a trace, their lives snuffed out by a man who would come to be known as the most prolific serial killer in American history. The struggle of detectives and victims' families, detectives assigned to the case, such as Faye Brooks, faced a daunting and overwhelming task. Each body that surfaced in or near the Green River presented a chilling reminder of the brutality behind the murders. Yet Ridgway was elusive, operating with chilling efficiency. Brooks, a survivor of child sexual abuse, empathized with the women who were being preyed upon. They were not just victims, they were someone's daughter, someone's sister. And for every missing person, the anguish was real for the families who couldn't grasp the truth of what had happened. As the investigation continued, Ridgway's skill at evading capture grew more apparent. He was a master manipulator, capable of blending into society while secretly orchestrating the brutal deaths of dozens. The pressure on law enforcement mounted as victims piled up, but there was no clear suspect until a breakthrough came. Maria Malvar was one of Ridgway's victims, and her disappearance in 1983 highlighted just how manipulative Ridgway could be. She had been seen getting into a truck with a man, and her boyfriend, worried about her safety, began to follow them. This event would eventually lead the police to Ridgway's door, but not without a struggle. Ridgway was calculated in his methods. He knew how to deceive and throw off suspicion. He was calm, ordinary even, and used this to his advantage. But the search continued, and his identity as the Green River Killer would eventually be uncovered. The discovery of the Green River Killer, in 2001, advancements in DNA testing allowed law enforcement to make a shocking connection. Ridgway, a seemingly mild-mannered truck painter, was the man who had eluded capture for so long. For years, he had been living a normal life, his dark secret concealed from the world. But when DNA from early victims, like Marcia Chapman, was matched with Ridgway's, the chilling truth emerged. The world was stunned. Gary Ridgway was the Green River Killer, responsible for the deaths of over 4 dozen women. His confession, when it finally came, was delivered with terrifying nonchalance, revealing the full extent of his monstrous actions. A man of terror and lies. While Ridgway's name became infamous across the Pacific Northwest, another man was wreaking havoc in the quiet corners of South Carolina. Donald Pee Wee Gaskins was a man of contradictions, small in stature, yet monstrous in his actions. His name would come to be known for brutality, cruelty, and an insatiable lust for control. Gaskins drove a hearse, a fitting vehicle for a man who saw death as a means of gaining power. He had a twisted relationship with life and death, and his reign of terror began in the late 1960s. But unlike Ridgway, Gaskins didn't just kill because of his twisted desires. He did it because he could. He enjoyed it. His victims were often hitchhikers, young women and children, those who could not fight back against his cruel will. Gaskins' terror was not just limited to his killing spree. His personality was defined by violence and manipulation. He was a man who used fear as a tool to control others, and his every move was calculated. Gaskins didn't just kill, he tortured. He wanted his victims to feel terror before he ended their lives. The psychology of a killer. What made these men who they were? Were they born to kill, or did the world shape them into monsters? For Gaskins, the roots of his violent tendencies can be traced back to his chaotic upbringing. Raised by an abusive mother and an absent father, Gaskins learned to view the world through a lens of anger and hatred. As a child, he was subjected to neglect, cruelty, and physical abuse. His relationship with his mother was particularly damaging. The bonds that should have been nurturing and protective were twisted into something unhealthy and disturbing. Gaskins, in many ways, became a product of his environment. His violent acts were not the result of some isolated event, but rather the culmination of years of abuse, neglect, and abandonment. Ridgway, too, showed signs of a troubled upbringing. His relationship with his mother was strained, and he was exposed to a toxic view of women. His father often derided prostitutes, and this had a profound impact on Ridgway's perceptions of women. But what truly separated Ridgway from Gaskins was his lack of remorse. Ridgway, it seemed, was a man capable of detaching himself from the humanity of his victims. They were merely objects, tools for him to satisfy his own desires. The unstoppable force of Gaskins' killing spree. As Gaskins' killing spree stretched into the 1970s, his ability to evade capture became a terrifying testament to his cunning. He would lure victims with promises of rides, and then he would exploit their vulnerability to carry out his grisly acts. Gaskins was adept at making people underestimate him. He was small, unassuming, but inside, he was a killer, one who would stop at nothing to feel the thrill of death. Unlike Ridgway, Gaskins didn't dispose of his victims with efficiency. He reveled in the process. He enjoyed the control he had over their lives, and the fear they felt before he ended their suffering. His killings were often accompanied by a sense of superiority, a twisted belief that he was somehow above others. By the 1980s, Gaskins had accumulated a body count that included at least 13 confirmed victims, though some believe the number may have been much higher. His killing didn't stop in the woods of South Carolina. It continued even behind bars. The truth behind the numbers in prison, Gaskins made a shocking claim. He had killed nearly 90 people. This boastful confession, however, was met with skepticism. Was Gaskins simply exaggerating to inflate his notoriety? Or was there a kernel of truth in his words? No one knows for sure. But what is undeniable is the fear Gaskins instilled in those around him. His victims were more than just numbers. They were people who had lives, families, and futures that were violently stolen away by a man who felt nothing for them. Gaskins didn't care about his victims. To him, they were disposable. His past had molded him into a man who saw others as nothing more than objects to be used for his pleasure. His claim of 90 victims was perhaps the most chilling part of his story. Did he really kill so many? Or was this simply a man with a need to be feared? Was he born to kill? Gary Ridgway and Donald Gaskins, two men whose lives were marred by violence, whose crimes forever changed the lives of those around them. Were they born to kill, or did their environments shape them into monsters? The answer is complex. Some criminologists argue that Gaskins was a product of his upbringing, a boy raised in violence and neglect who turned to crime as a means of survival. Ridgway, on the other hand, may have been predisposed to violence from an early age, his distorted view of women cemented by his father's cruelty. But one thing is clear. Both men were products of their environments, twisted and shaped by the darkness they encountered in their formative years. Whether or not they were born to kill, their lives reveal a chilling truth. Evil can take root in the most unsuspecting places, and even the most ordinary-looking individuals can become monsters. The legacy of pain. For the victims' families, the discovery of Ridgway and Gaskins' identities brought little comfort. The pain of losing a loved one to such brutality is immeasurable, and no amount of justice could bring back those who were lost. But for those who survived, there was closure in knowing that the men responsible for the atrocities would never walk free again. The names of Ridgway and Gaskins will forever be tied to the darkest corners of human nature. They represent the fear we all carry, that the monsters who walk among us are often the ones we least suspect. As we reflect on the lives of Gary Ridgway and Donald Gaskins, we are left with one haunting question: what made them who they were? Were they born to kill, or were they shaped by a world that failed to protect them from their own twisted desires? In the end, the truth may never be fully understood. What remains is the terrifying reality that evil can exist in the most ordinary of people. And as the world moves on, the shadows of these killers will continue to loom large, a reminder that monsters can exist in even the most unlikely of places.